The writing test requires you to write one letter, and it's based on input, typically case notes, which you read in the first 5 minutes of the test, and then you write a response to the case notes, typically a letter of some kind, in the remaining 40 minutes. So it's a 45-minute test in total. What does the writing sub-test actually look at? Well, it tests, and this is taken from the OET website itself, your ability to produce a profession-specific letter, a nursing letter for nurses, a medicine letter for doctors, a pharmacy-based letter for pharmacists. Normally, or usually, these are letters of referral or transfer or discharge, certainly for nurses and for doctors, and they're based on a typical workplace situation, and they're very much closely related to your professional practice, which is what makes this such a good test, because of course it relates to OET, writing for your particular job. Other kinds of letters do exist. So for example, pharmacists might be asked to write an advisory or informational letter. Radiographers may be asked to write a response to a complaint. But in all cases, these letters relate very closely to the requirements of the job that you do. And that's, I think, what is so good about OET. Not only is it a test of your English, but by learning to do well in OET, you may well be improving your skills in your job area. In terms, again, of the format, the input, as we've talked about, case notes or other profession-related documentation. And from those, you then are asked to write a letter of between 180 and 200 words. When it comes to the marking, the letters are marked by a minimum of 2 independent OET assessors based in Australia. They don't see what each other has commented on your letter. They're completely independent. And the letter itself is marked against 6 criteria. And if you're looking as a nurse or a doctor, in most countries around the world, your requirements is a score of 350 in writing. Some professions may require higher. Different countries have different requirements. So it's important that you take responsibility for checking this yourselves. So let's now look at the 45 minutes you had in the test and how you should be using your time. Well, the first thing to know is that in OET writing for the first 5 minutes, the only thing you can do is read. You're not allowed a pencil to mark the paper-based version of the case note. It's reading time. So what does that mean? Well, that means for the first 5 minutes, you should be focusing on the key information in the case notes, making initial choices in terms of what information you think is important for the reader and what information is not important. So here is a set of case notes, and you'll notice that I've divided it into 4 sections. What some candidates do is they look at the case notes, they start at the top, they read through, and then at the end they get to the writing task. I actually think we can do better than that. The first thing that we should be doing at the beginning of those 5 minutes is look at the end of the case notes and look at the writing task, because this tells you what you need to do. And if you know what you need to do, you can then read the case notes in a more intense and intensive way. So we know for this letter that we're writing a discharge letter. So the patient is getting better and they're ready to be leaving the medical facility where they have been receiving care. And they're being discharged into the care of a lady called Georginette Ponsford, who is a resident community nurse at a retirement home. We have her address. That'll be the address at the top of the letter. We also know that this letter will go with Mr. Ramaburfi back to the retirement home when he's discharged tomorrow. So immediately we're thinking, okay, so this retirement home will be responsible for Mr. Ramamurthy's continuity of care. Has he been there before? Is he already a resident, or is he going there for the first time? And that will affect the information we need to give in the case notes. So once you've read the writing task, I think it's often quite nice to know about your patient. So here we go into the top of the case notes. We find out more about Mr. Ramamurthy, give him his name and a bit more personal detail, including where he lives. He lives at the community retirement home. That means the retirement home knows about him, and therefore information like his past medical history won't be necessary because they already know it. So by looking at the task and identifying the relationship between the reader and the writer, we already have clues as to what to include and what to omit, not include in our letter. So 1, read the writing task. 2, find out about the patient. And then 3, and here's a trick, when you look at the rest of the case notes, I suggest you read it backwards by section. So rather than looking at the admission date and the discharge date, begin by looking at what's happening most recently. Here we get the discharge plan, the assessment, he's made good progress and is therefore now ready for discharge, and we find out about the nursing management. As we go backwards, we find out about his admission, pneumonia, his progress whilst he was in the hospital, then background information. Now, in an OET letter, the information that's required by the task very often comes towards the end of the case notes. There will be other information that's important, but it makes sense to focus first on that key information that needs to be transferred into your letter. So once more, writing task first, patient basic information second, body of the case notes backwards third. Okay, so we've read the case notes, we've decided what's important. What about annotating the case notes? Well, the timing is important here. You are now into the remaining 40 minutes of the OET test. You've had your 5 minutes reading time, you've read the case notes, and now you're ready to start your plan. And we'll talk a little bit more about plans in a moment. Let's look and see what that actually looks like. So here are the case notes. What I'd like you to do, please, is read the case notes and decide in your view what is important here. So we're picking up, we're writing a letter, it's 180 to 200 words. It's a discharge letter. We know the receiver, the recipient, and we also know from having looked briefly about Mr. Ramamurthy when he lives, that he's a known patient to Georgina Pomsford. He lives in the nursing home where she's the resident community nurse. If we then look at the information about Mr. Ramamurthy, a lot of this information will be irrelevant. For example, we don't need to tell Georgina that he lives at the community retirement home. She may have in fact been the person who initially contacted the hospital for his admission. So what information here do you think is necessary? And I'm asking these questions because these reflect the kind of questions that you should be asking at the point where you are annotating the case notes in the exam and deciding what to include in your letter. Well, you've probably decided that the patient's name is important for the letter. The admission and the discharge date are important. They tell us how long he was in hospital, and also the diagnosis. But information about the next of kin is really not necessary, nor is the marital status. It has no bearing on this case because Mr. Ramamurthy is in a community retirement home. That is where he is cared for. If we then look at the case notes, you'll soon see that a lot of information needs to go from here into the letter, because we're being asked to write a discharge letter. Inevitably then, the reader needs to know what should happen on discharge. So everything in the discharge plan will be important. The reader is very likely wanting to know how Mr. Ramamurthy is following his admission. So the fact that he's made good progress overall will also be important. And in terms of the nursing management received in hospital, you'll notice how much of this relates to the discharge plan. So encouraging oral fluids and proper nutrition is repeated here. We don't need to write it twice, and this is where planning comes in. we can see how things relate from one section of the case notes to another. If something appears twice, it doesn't mean that you need to write it twice. Instead, we might refer to what happened in nursing management and then expand it in the discharge plan paragraph in our letter. As we move up, we'll start seeing that information higher up in the case notes really is not always necessary. So the past medical history, issues with his eyesight have no bearing on pneumonia. Likewise, the osteoarthritis. The social background, not relevant, although the weight loss may be, because later on we see that in hospital he's put weight back on. And obviously having a healthy weight gives strength and therefore is related to the quality of recovery from his pneumonia. Medical history, not necessary because we know that Georgina knows him, and that therefore doesn't need to be restated. But we are almost certainly going to want to look at the medical background and the medical progress in order to make decisions about what would the reader want to see. Okay, so in the next couple of slides, what you're going to see are annotations. You'll see here the system that I recommend people who work with me, my students use. If information is essential, it gets 2 ticks. If it's information where I'm not so sure if it's needed or not, 1 tick. And you can either have blank or cross out anything that's not necessary. So as you'll see here, the social background of the masked medical history are all crossed out, they're not relevant. Patient detailed information is crossed out. And I've given 1 tick to the 2018 COPD diagnosis, which may be of value relating to the fact that he's been admitted for pneumonia. But then as I thought about it, I decided that really wasn't relevant because the reader will know that this patient has COPD. What we have here in pneumonia might be classed as an exacerbation of the COPD in terms of symptomology. Okay, so we've talked about annotating. Now let's think about the paragraph plan and how we go about doing that. If you fail to plan, you are arguably planning to fail. It's as simple as that. So here are some questions that will help to guide us in that planning. 3 questions. We've already seen why you shouldn't include all of the information in the case notes. If it's information that the reader already has, there's no need to tell them again. Number 2, it's important that your letter is easy to read with the key information appearing towards the top. That may not, therefore, necessarily follow the order of the case notes themselves. Finally, the number of paragraphs, well, that's up to you. There is no fixed number of paragraphs overall for an OET letter, nor is there a perfect number of paragraphs for any OET letter. So what you need to think about is what does the reader need and what order do they need to see that information. To look into that in a bit more detail, if you write a letter following the order of the case notes, then for Lionel Ramon Murphy, you're going to start by giving background information. Then you're going to follow his journey, and then at the end, you'll come to the discharge. And that follows the case notes. That ends up with information perhaps appearing twice in the letter. That's confusing for the reader. Instead, you might want to consider a chronological approach, the time order from the start of the case to the end. But that's not always the best way to do it. If you have a complex chronic condition with the patient presenting on multiple occasions with worsening symptoms, perhaps as a referral letter, then in fact what you might want to do is not have a paragraph for each visit, But you might begin by talking about the situation today and having that in one paragraph, and then summarizing the deterioration of the symptoms, the increase in medication in follow-up paragraphs. So as you can see from the second part of the slide here on the right, there are other ways besides chronological that will be useful. And here they are, 1, 2, and 3. The point here is for you to decide which one makes the reading of the letter clear and logical for your reader. The next thing to say is about OET letters and sandwiches. Bread, filling, bread. This represents the purpose paragraph where you tell the reader why you are writing. The bottom slice of bread, the final paragraph, will refer to what happens next, the request for action or the next steps to be taken. The filling in the middle of the letter represents the ingredients, if you like, from the case notes, the middle paragraphs. So if we look at that in terms of the Lionel Rama-Murphy letter, what we then have in our slice of bread at the top is the purpose. Why are we writing to Georgina Ponsford? The end of the letter will be the discharge plan once the patient returns home to the community retirement building. And then the middle paragraphs will be the information required by Ms. Ponsford. The fact of what he was admitted, why he was admitted, what happened in hospital, with this being the key information for the reader. So in a paper-based version of the test, your plan might look like this. You can number the paragraphs if you like. We'll call the first one purpose. We'll call the final one, the bottom slice of bread, NS, next steps. And in the middle, the filling, we're going to have his medical background, the fact that he was presenting with pneumonia, that he was admitted on the 4th, that he had an assessment, but that he's now ready for discharge. He's made good progress. And then we'll might, in the follow-up paragraph, the second filling paragraph, we'll talk about relevant medical progress and the nursing management he received, which links into the next steps.